They called me peculiar. Not to my face, mostly. You learn, after 31 years of cleaning other people's buildings, that the staff who want to say something unkind will find the corridor, the break room, the loading bay, the space just outside your hearing where their voices carry anyway. I heard it the first time in the spring of my 3rd year at the Kethavar, diplomatic compound, Eastern Frontier Post. A junior attaché named something forgettable told a junior cook named something worse that the night shift maid on level B talked to walls. I remember thinking, not quite right. I talked to the door. There is a difference, and the difference matters. My name is Asta Farron. I am 63 years old, and I have worked the night shift at the Eastern Frontier Post for 11 years. Before that, I worked the same shift at a transit medical bay in the Orith Lowlands sector for 9 years. And before that, I worked it at a sorting warehouse for 6 years. And before that for a chain of residential compounds for 7 years. And before any of that, I was a younger woman who thought she would do something else. 31 years is a long time to be a person nobody looks at. You learn to find the things that are worth looking at yourself. The door was on sublevel B, Junction Corridor 4, at the eastern end of the compound, where the old drainage infrastructure ran under the foundation, and the ceiling tiles hummed from the ventilation loops, and nobody had any reason to go, because the only thing at the end of that corridor was a maintenance access panel and a sealed utility alcove that hadn't been opened in 6 years, according to the compound maintenance log. I wasn't supposed to be reading. I read it anyway. I read everything. Another thing they called peculiar. I found the alcove on my 2nd week at the post. I was following a persistent damp smell that I suspected was a slow condensation leak in the northeastern foundation wall, a suspicion that turned out to be correct, and which I reported in writing to the facility's deputy, who did not act on it for 4 months, at which point the problem had grown from a slow drip to a visible bloom of pale, rust-colored mineral deposit on the lower wall tiles. I noted this in my follow-up report. The facility's deputy thanked me by name for the first time in my 11 years, which tells you something about the relationship between effort and recognition in a large diplomatic compound. But I am getting ahead of myself. 2nd week, damp smell. Eastern corridor. The alcove door was a standard sealed utility panel floor to ceiling, with a biometric latch that was rated inactive in the log, meaning the lock mechanism still read DNA, but matched it against an empty approval registry, meaning anyone the system didn't know would be turned away, and anyone it did know was no longer here. I stood in front of it for a moment. The damp smell was stronger there. I made a note. I moved on. The second time I stopped at that door, a month later, was because I heard something. You have to understand what a working night shift sounds like inside a large compound after the last of the diplomatic staff have cleared out. The HVAC runs at a lower cycle. The fluorescent strips in the public corridors switch to half output. The cleaning machines, the floor polishers, the wet vacuum units, the duct brushing rigs, all go quiet by 2 in the morning, leaving only the ones driven by a human hand, which was me, my cart. The soft wheel squeak I'd long since stopped hearing. The occasional ground tremor from a freight passage overhead. So when I heard the sound, I heard it clearly. It was not a mechanical sound. It was not a ventilation harmonic. It was something lower and more deliberate. A vibration that came in irregular intervals, 8 or 9 seconds apart. The kind of rhythm you get from something alive and breathing, in a space too small for comfortable breathing. I stood at my cart. I turned off the floor polisher. The sound continued. I knocked on the door. 3 knocks, knuckles flat. The way you knock when you want someone to know you're there but you don't want to alarm them. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. I wrote it down in my personal log, not the official cleaning record, my own notebook, a habit I had developed over many years as a way of keeping track of things I noticed that nobody else seemed to. Unexplained vibration, Eastern Alcove, Junction 4B, Old Fort 4, possible fauna ingress through foundation drainage. Then I moved on, because the first floor ambassador wing still needed mopping, and I had 2.5 hours before the day shift began. But I came back the following night, and the one after that. On the 5th night, I brought a small portion of the food I kept in my cleaning cart for my own meal break, a portion of pressed grain and a folded package of dried protein strips. They were simple field rations, That the compound kitchen sold cheaply in the staff canteen, because nobody in the diplomatic corps would touch them. I set the food on the floor in front of the door. I waited. Nothing moved for a long time. Then, slowly, thin dark line appeared at the base of the door. Not the door opening, but a gap, a crack, a half-centimeter of darkness that had not been there before. The food disappeared in the space of about 4 seconds. The crack closed. I stood in the corridor for a moment with my hands in my apron pockets. Then I said quietly, "I'll come back tomorrow." I went to finish the ambassador wing. That was how it started. I did not tell anyone. Not because I made a deliberate decision to keep a secret, because I had learned a long time ago that the things I found worth noticing were not, in general, the things other people found worth their time. Told the facility's deputy about the damp smell. I told the security liaison about a suspicious repeat pattern in the overnight access log that I thought suggested someone was propping a service door on level A for extended periods on alternating nights. That one turned out to be a junior. Ache sneaking out to the rooftop to eat, which was its own particular kind of statement about diplomatic morale. I told the compound director twice about the drainage infrastructure under Junction 4B, which had never been properly maintained since the construction expansion in '09. Nobody had ever looked at me the way people look at you when you have said something worth their full attention. I had learned to stop waiting for it, so I brought food to the door every night, and I knocked 3 times before I set it down. And after the 3rd week I started talking, formatively, not loudly. The way you talk to a cat through a vent or a horse in a dark stable. Low even, nothing that required an answer, just a human voice with no urgency in it. I talked about the floor polisher's left wheel bearing was developing an uneven wear pattern that would need replacing in another 40 days or so. I talked about the condensation bloom on the northeast wall, which had finally been scraped and sealed, but which I expected to return, because the deputy had sealed the surface and not addressed the underlying foundation joint. I talked about the minor political friction developing between the 3rd Directorate attachés and the Velarath liaison staff, which I knew about because I emptied their waste bins and overheard their corridor conversations and read the communiques they left face-up on desks. When they stepped out, which is not snooping, but is simply the condition of existing in a building that other people use without thinking about who else is in it. The thing behind the door did not reply, but on the 8th night when I set down the food and began talking, I heard it settle, shift of weight, a particular release of breath. The way something does when it goes from tense to not tense, and you know the difference because you've been around enough tense things to recognize what the absence of it sounds like. Started bringing more food. Not dramatically more. I did not want to create a pattern in the kitchen inventory that someone might eventually notice. But I added dried fruit when I could get it. A small flask of warm broth on cold nights, which were most nights in the Frontier Compound's eastern wing, because the heating loop in that section was chronically underpowered. Another item on my list of reported but unaddressed infrastructure concerns. I folded the broth flask in a cloth so it stayed warm through the first half of my shift. On the 23rd night, the door opened. Not all the way. It's 12 centimeters. Enough for me to see one eye, wide-set golderized, slit-pupilled in the dim corridor light, and below it, the edge of a jaw that was definitely scaled. The scales small and close-set near the jaw hinge, a deep blue-gray color that caught the corridor's half-output fluorescent strips, and threw back something faintly iridescent. Not pale, not smooth, not anything like a person dressed up as something. A jaw that had grown that way, that had always been that way, with the texture of something that had been made for harder conditions than a utility alcove in a diplomatic compound on the eastern frontier, did not move. I kept my hands in my apron pockets, I said. "You don't have to come further. I just wanted you to know I could see you." The eye blinked. Slowly vertically, a nictitating membrane, the secondary inner eyelid, sweeping up from below. I had read enough to know what that was. I had never seen one in the membrane. It was a strange thing to feel moved by, but I was. I set down the food and the broth flask. I said the thing I said every night, "I'll come back tomorrow." I went to do the ambassador wing. After that, the door was open by 12 centimeters every night when I arrived. Never more, never less. It was a form of calibration, I thought. 12 centimeters was enough to receive the food and hear the voice. It was not enough to be seen fully, or to be caught if someone else came around. Corner, it was a negotiated position, arrived at without any discussion. I respected it. I did not try to widen it. By the 6th week I had a rough sense of the thing's size. Larger than a hatchling, given the depth of the breathing sound and the scale of the jaw, not adult large. Young, not newly young, not infant small, but the size of something that had been growing for years and had not finished. The scales at the jaw hinge were still bright. There was something faintly asymmetric about the two small protrusions I could see above the jaw, which I thought at first were structural irregularities, but which I came to understand, over time, were the base nubs of crest ridges that had grown in at slightly different angles, not damaged, just uneven, the way a young thing grows before it has grown all the way. In the 5th week, I began leaving small things alongside the food. Not sentimental things. I am not a sentimental person, or at least I have learned over a long time to be careful about the direction sentiment takes. Practical things. A folded cloth, because the alcove floor was bare concrete, and the ventilation loop made the eastern end of sublevel B3 degrees colder than the rest of the level, a fact I had reported in my infrastructure log, and which had never been addressed. A small packet of a mineral supplement that the compound kitchen kept for the livestock transport teams that occasionally staged through the rear, loading bays. I had read enough of the Vel-Orith bonding house's publicly available cultural documentation to know that juveniles of that lineage required higher mineral intake during the crest ridge development phase. Though I did not know at the time that I was looking at a Vel-Orith juvenile specifically, only that I was looking at something young enough to still be growing and isolated enough to be doing it on whatever it could get through a 12-centimeter door gap. I wrote a note on the packet explaining what it was and why I thought it might be useful. I do not know if the thing behind the door could read the common tongue. But the packet disappeared the first night I left it, and I chose to interpret that as confirmation of a working hypothesis, rather than coincidence. On the 41st night, it spoke, not in any language I had learned. A low, resonant sequence of tonal intervals, too short. One long, too short again, that I recognized, after a moment, as a variation of the 3-knock pattern I had been using every night. It was not mimicry, or not only mimicry. It was a reply in kind. I had knocked. Now it was knocking back. I stood very still for a moment. Then I knocked again. 3, the same as always. Replied. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. We did this 4 times. Then I set down food and said I'd come back tomorrow and went to do the floors, and I was most of the way to the ambassador wing before I noticed that my hands were not entirely steady, which had not happened to me in a work setting in many years. I named it nothing. I made a firm decision about this early on, not to name it, not to build the kind of attachment that a name creates, because I was honest enough with myself to know that whatever was in that alcove had a situation that I did not fully understand, and that my understanding of it might change, and that names made things harder to let go of. So I called it nothing. I thought of it, when I thought of it, as the presence behind the door, which is accurate, and which carries no weight either way. The door, by the 7th week, was open to 22 centimeters. I tell you this not to suggest progress in a narrative sense. I am not interested in charming you with a tidally escalating warmth, but because it was the measurement I was using to understand how the situation was developing, and because what happened in the 7th week made the measurement matter. On the 51st night, I rounded the corner to junction 4B and found the door at 0 centimeters, closed. Completely closed, the way it had been on the first night, and standing in front of it, with a tablet in one hand, and the posture of someone conducting an official inspection, was a man I had seen twice before in passing. A compound compliance officer from the Frontier Resource Management Authority, name tag reading Cavill Oren, who had been posted to the compound 2 weeks prior for a routine infrastructure audit, and who had, based on my own monitoring of the access logs, twice visited sublevel B during off hours. He looked at my cart. He looked at me, he said, "This corridor is on the restricted access addendum. Night cleaning staff don't have scheduled duties below junction 3, on sublevel B," I said. Junction 3 designation covers the laundry return lines and the East-HVAC manifold. Junction 4 was grandfathered under the original building maintenance scope in the compound charter. Section 11 predates the restricted access addendum by 9 years. I have a copy of Section 11 in my cart if you'd like to see it. He did not want to see it. But he also did not tell me to leave, because the thing about citing a specific section of a specific charter is that it forces the other person to either know the document or admit they don't. And most people in his position had not read Section 11 of the compound charter because there was no reason to read it, unless you were a night shift maid who had spent 2.5 years documenting unreported infrastructure concerns in a personal notebook. He left, but he came back the following week with a different document, a remediation order, classified under the Frontier Resource Efficiency Protocols, authorized him to seal and fumigate any unoccupied structural cavity identified as a potential infestation site or unauthorized occupancy risk in the compound's sublevel infrastructure. The document was real. The authority was real. The only thing required to action, it was a supervisor's countersignature, and his supervisor was the compound's own facilities deputy, who owed me no particular loyalty, and who had, I thought, never fully forgiven me for the follow-up memo about the mineral bloom. I went to see the facilities deputy the next morning, before my sleep cycle, which meant I had been awake for 17 hours, and looked it, brought my notebook. I sat across from him, at his desk, which was tidy in the manner of desks whose occupants want the appearance of tidiness, rather than the reality of it. And I opened the notebook to the infrastructure section, and I said, the Eastern Foundation joint under Junction 4B has not been addressed. If the compliance officer's remediation order is actioned, the fumigation process will require sealed envelope injection of pressurized compound, which will apply lateral stress to an already compromised joint. I am estimating a 40 to 60% probability of accelerated joint failure within 6 to 18 months, which would affect the load-bearing capacity of the eastern wing's lower corridor. I slid the notebook across to him. Have the documentation. The deputy looked at the notebook. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've been tracking this since 2012. 2011, I said. The first entry is dated spring of my first year. He looked at me. He was not looking at me in the way people looked at me usually, which was the way you look at a piece of furniture you have decided to tolerate. He was looking at me in the way you look at something you have been underestimating and have just realized it. It was a new look, coming from him, and I did not particularly trust it yet. But he did not countersign the remediation order. He cited a structural review pending notation on the Eastern Foundation assessment. It was a bureaucratic maneuver I had not anticipated, but which I recognized for what it was, a door left open. Not necessarily for my benefit. Open. I went home. I slept 4 hours. I came back that night and knocked 3 times on the alcove door and set down the food and said the thing I always said, and the door opened to 22 centimeters, and everything was the same as it had been. Except that on the 63rd night, I heard it cry. I'm careful with that word. I know what crying sounds like in a human being, and I know that different creatures express distress in different ways, and I am not trying to project a human experience onto something that was not human. But the sound I heard through that door on the 63rd night had the qualities that crying has. It was involuntary, from the sound of it. It was sustained at a frequency that suggested pain or grief rather than fear. And it stopped when I knocked, not gradually the way sounds stop when a source runs down, but abruptly, the way sounds stop when the thing making them becomes aware of being heard, and is not sure whether being heard is safe. That kind of stopping. I had heard that kind of stopping before, in other corridors, in other buildings, in other parts of my working life. Child in a medical bay who hadn't seen their family in 3 days. A man in his 70s in a residential compound whose wife had died in the spring and who sometimes sat in the stairwell at 2 in the morning because the flat was too quiet. I had not been trained to respond to those moments. There is no training for it. You either stop or you don't. And stopping is not heroic. It is simply what you do. When you are the person in the corridor and you are not in a hurry, and the sound you hear is the sound of something that does not want to be alone, which is a thing most living creatures, have in common, regardless of the number of their limbs or the color of their eyes. I had always stopped. I was not going to start not stopping now. I did not pretend I had not heard it. I said, "I hear you." Then I set down the food, and I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall opposite the door, which was something I had never done. And I said, "I'm going to stay a while tonight. You don't have to do anything." I sat there for 2 hours. I talked, low and even, the way I always did. The floor polisher bearing, the deputy's structural review notation, the third directorate attachés who had been having increasingly sharp corridor conversations with the Vel Orith liaison staff, whose formal designation I had finally identified from a compound directory addendum that I was also not supposed to have read. The Vel Orith Bonding House. A name I did not know. I told this to the door. I don't know enough about the Vel Orith Bonding House to have an opinion, but the liaison's team seems to be here for something they consider important. And on the other side of the door, the crying sound did not return, and the breathing settled into the even rhythm I had come to know, the one that meant not tense. I stayed until it did. I went to do the floors late that night. The ambassador wing was not entirely finished when the day shift came on, and I left a note on the floor station board, explaining that sublevel B had required additional time. I used the structural inspection language. Nobody asked me about it. The 78th night, the door opened to 40 centimeters. I could see for the first time the shape of the thing more fully. It was crouched, no settled. Something large settles when it has been in a small space a long time and has found the position that costs the least effort. The scale color at the jaw was the deep blue-gray I had seen before. Further back along the neck, the scales darkened to a near black, with an iridescent edge that caught the fluorescent light in a way that made it, briefly, like deep water in the dark. The crest ridges, the asymmetric ones, were more visible now, small, not yet grown out to their full reach, angled slightly, off from each other, the way young things grow before their body has decided what it's doing. The eyes were still gold. The pupils in the corridor light were narrow as threads. It was looking at me. Not the way something looks at you when it is deciding whether you are a threat. The way something looks at you when it has decided you are not, and is looking because it wants to. I said, "Hello," because sometimes the right word is the plain one. It made a sound. Not the too short one long of the knock reply, and not the low interval sequence from the earlier weeks. Something shorter, softer, more like a single note held briefly and released. I did not know what it meant. I said, "I don't know what that means yet, but I'll keep learning." Set down the food and the broth flask. I stayed until the food was gone. On the 89th night, the compliance officer came back. This time he had a counter-signature. Not from the facilities deputy. The deputy's structural review notation was still active, but from the compound's overall resource director, a different line of authority entirely, one I had not anticipated, because it required the officer to escalate beyond the compound's internal command structure to a frontier authority, regional office. That was not standard procedure for a sub-level fumigation order. It was someone who had decided the first obstacle was worth going around. I stood in the corridor and read the document. Oren watched me read it. He looked like a man who had done something difficult and wanted credit for having done it. I said, "This is a regional countersignature. The Regional Frontier Authority doesn't have jurisdiction over compound sublevels under the diplomatic charter." I was not entirely certain of this. I was certain enough. Comp sublevels are subject to diplomatic compound protocols, which are governed by the Joint Diplomatic Infrastructure Agreement of 2007. Section 4C specifies that any remediation or alteration of structural sublevel spaces requires consent from the senior diplomatic resident, which would be the third directorate's compound director, not the regional resource authority. Oren stared at me. "You're a cleaning staff member." "Yes," I said. The Section 4C citation is in the Joint Diplomatic Infrastructure Agreement. It's a public document. You can access it on the Frontier Authority's own reference library. I closed his document and handed it back to him. I'd recommend checking with the compound director before proceeding. He left. He came back in 3 days with a compound director counter-signature. I had 3 days to think. And what I arrived at was the honest fact of the situation. I had been delaying this with paperwork. Paperwork is a finite resource, and compliance officers have institutional patience that individuals don't. Sooner or later, the remediation order would be actioned. Sooner or later, the alcove would be opened, and what was inside would be found, and what was found would be processed by people who processed things without looking at them. Shh. On the night between receiving the original order and the director's countersignature, I went to Junction 4B and sat down across from the door, and I said, out loud, to the full corridor, I don't know what you are. I don't know why you're here. I don't know who's looking for you, or if anyone is, or what happens to you, if they find you or if they don't. Shh. I'm a cleaning staff member at a diplomatic compound. I've been keeping you company for 3 months because you were in my corridor, and you were in distress, and those are the only reasons I need. I paused. But I am going to need you to tell me something, if you know how. Even one thing. Because I am running out of ways to stall a man with a fumigation order. The door opened. Not 12 centimeters. Not 22. Not 40. All the way. I had a moment of utter stillness. The kind that comes not from shock, but from the arrival of something you have been approaching, without knowing it and have not prepared for. The creature in the alcove was roughly the size of a large draft animal, crouched to fit the space, its back plates grazing the upper edge of the door frame. The deep blue-gray of the neck scales spread across the back and shoulders into a pattern, interlocking plates, the iridescent edge quality of each one more visible now that the corridor light hit the full surface. Not one color, but a field of colors. The way things look when they have depth, and the light has to travel through them before it comes back to you. Crest ridges, the asymmetric ones, had, I noticed for the first time, a faint secondary color along their leading edge, a pale copper warm tone, barely there. The kind of color that is so subtle you think you are imagining it until you see it again and again, and understand it is a feature and trick of the light. The eyes were still gold. The pupils, fully open in the dimness, were wide now, soft-edged, not narrow threads. On the scales of the upper right shoulder, visible now that I could see the whole animal, there was a marking, not a wound, not a scar. A cluster of small scale plates that had grown in a different color from the surrounding field, a deep blue-black, with a particular geometric regularity. The way pigmentation arranges itself when it is not accidental, but is the body expressing something it was designed to express. I had read enough over the years to know that in bonding house lineages, shoulder ridge markings indicated hereditary branch affiliation. I did not know enough to read what this specific pattern said. I looked at it for a moment, and then I looked at the gold eyes, and the gold eyes looked back, and I said, all right, I see you now. I did not know what the marking meant. I recorded it in my notebook that night, a careful sketch, dimensions estimated, color noted. I went home and I spent 4 hours of my off hours with the compound's public access diplomatic reference files, looking for Vel-Orith bonding house lineage documentation, which was not easy to find, and which I was almost certain I was not supposed to be looking for, but which I found eventually, because the Vel-Orith house was old enough that its founding branch registries had been digitized as part of a historical record preservation initiative, and the preservation initiative's archive was technically public because it was technically a library. What I found in the library was a shoulder ridge marking chart for the Vel-Orith founding branch continuation lines. There were 7 branch designations. 6 of them used colorations I recognized from the general literature. The 7th used a deep blue-black with a geometric regularity that the chart described as the marking of the matriarch designate line, the line of succession, the next inheritor of the Vel-Orith bonding house's founding seat. I sat with that for a moment. Then I made tea, because I had been awake for 19 hours, and I needed something hot, and I drank it at my kitchen table, and I thought about the asymmetric crest, ridges and the copper warm leading edge, and the way the door had opened a little further each week, and the way the crying had stopped when I said I hear you, and I thought, I am a 63-year-old night shift maid in a frontier diplomatic compound, and the thing I have been feeding through a door for 3 months is the matriarch designate of the Vel-Orith bonding house. I did not panic. This is not because I am unusually composed. But because when you have spent 31 years being invisible in other people's important spaces, you develop a particular relationship with the weight of things. The things around you are often large. Your role in them is often small. You learn to hold large information in a small container without the container breaking. I went back to sleep. I got up at my usual hour. I went to my shift. On the night I received the director countersigned remediation order, I went to Junction 4B. I knocked 3 times. The door opened all the way. It had been opening all the way now, every night, for 12 nights. I sat down in front of it, with my back against the corridor wall, the position I had started using since the 63rd night, and I told the truth. I said, "Someone found the right paperwork to open this door. I think I have 4 or 5 more days before they come with it, and I want to be honest with you about that, rather than let it happen without warning. I don't know what you want to do with that. I don't know if you can leave safely, or if there's somewhere for you to go, or if there are people I don't know about who you'd want me to reach. If there are, tell me how, and I will. I am very good at reading documents I'm not supposed to read." The gold eyes were steady. The large body was still. Outside in the corridor, the HVAC ran at its lower cycle, and the fluorescent strips held at half output and somewhere on. The level above a freight passage went through in the night, and the compound settled around us the way compounds do. Presence behind the door, I still called it that even now, made a sound I had not heard before. Not the knock reply, not the single soft note, a longer sequence, complex, with something in its tonal structure that, if I had to give it a human analogy, I would describe as naming patterned. The way speech sounds when it is conveying a specific referent and not just expression. I listened to all of it. I said, "I don't know what that is, but I'm recording it." I wrote it down as best I could in the notebook. Tonal shapes, interval lengths, the way the sequence was weighted at the beginning and at the end. 3 nights later, at approximately 2:40 in the morning, the compound perimeter alarm sounded. Not the emergency alarm, but the arrival notification tone, the 2-pulse signal. That meant an unscheduled vessel had entered the compound's designated approach corridor and been cleared by the perimeter authority. This happened occasionally when diplomatic missions arrived outside their posted schedule, and it was not in itself unusual. What was unusual was the number of pulses. The arrival notification tone pulsed twice for a standard diplomatic arrival. It pulsed 4 times for a priority diplomatic arrival, which required the compound director to be on the receiving pad. 4 pulsed twice in my 11 years. That night it pulsed 7 times. I was in the ambassador wing when it pulsed. Stopped mopping. I counted 7. I stood in the corridor for a moment with the mop handle in both hands. Then I looked at my watch. Then I went back to mopping. Because the ambassador wing floor did not care arrival notification tone, and I had learned not to stop work for things I could not act on. 40 minutes later, I heard footsteps on the Junction 4 corridor that I had never heard before. Not the purposeful stride of the compliance officer, not the occasional late-night step of a diplomatic scaffer. Many footsteps in a particular rhythm. That rhythm belongs to people who have been trained to move in formation and maintain it even in narrow corridors. I finished the ambassador wing, and I pushed my cart to the sub-level B access stairwell, and I went down. The Junction 4 corridor was full. Not crowded in the human sense, not bodies packed in. But the corridor, which had been empty every night of my 11 years, now contained 7 figures. And the word figure is the honest one because they were not human-shaped. Not in the way people sometimes use that word to mean upright and 2-armed. They were large. The 2 at the front were roughly my size in the torso but wider across the shoulders, with heads that were long and flat-skulled, scaled in the dark iron gray of something old and repeatedly tested, crest ridges developed and mature, broad at the base, tapering to a forward curve that meant they had grown all the way out. Behind them were 4 others in a formation that had, even in the confines of the corridor, the precise geometry of a unit that knew its own spacing. And at the center of the formation, 1 step behind the front 2, was the 7th figure. Taller, stills, with a particular stillness of something that generates authority without intending to, the way a tree in a field generates stillness around it. Because it has been there long enough, and is large enough that the air near it has learned to behave. I stepped into the corridor with my cart. The two front figures turned. Their eyes found me, I said. The alcove is the sealed door at the end. The biometric latch was rated inactive, but the mechanism still reads. If you have someone in your party who's registered to it, they should be able to open it from this side. There was a pause. Taller figure at the center turned and looked at me, and I had the experience that I imagine one sometimes has when looking at a mountain for the first time. Not fear exactly, but a particular recalibration of the body's understanding of what large means. The eyes were dark, the color of deep water where there is no bottom. The crest ridges were enormous, not in a way that was decorative, but in a way that was simply the result of living long enough and growing all the way. The shoulder markings were not discrete geometric patterns like the one I had sketched. Full shoulder distribution of markings that were so extensive they had ceased to be markings and had become something closer to a landscape, a history written in scale-deep pigmentation. The figure looked at me for a long moment. Then it looked at the corridor. The floor I had mopped, the wall tiles I had maintained, the half-output fluorescent strips, whose burned-out units I had replaced myself when the maintenance requests were delayed, the space I had worked in every night for 11 years. That was now for the first time under someone else's full scrutiny. One of the front two said something in the tonal language, a sequence I could not follow. The tall Cicerone Center replied briefly. Then the front two moved aside. The tall figure walked to the alcove door, not with haste, with the particular steady movement of something that has traveled a long distance and has arrived and does not need to rush now. It stood in front of the sealed panel. It placed one large scaled hand against the biometric latch panel. The latch, which had been rated inactive for 6 years, which matched against an empty approval registry, which should have read a blank. Clicked. The door opened. I had stepped back to give space. I kept my hand on my cart. I watched. Presence behind the door. The thing I had been bringing food to for 3 months. The thing with the asymmetric crest ridges, and the copper-warm leading edge, and the deep blue-black shoulder marking, and the gold eyes, came out of the alcove slowly, in the manner of something that has been in a small space too long, and is learning, incrementally, that it is now allowed to be larger. It emerged into the corridor light and straightened. Not fully, not in one gesture, but gradually, one segment at a time, the way something unfolds when it has been folded for a long while, and needs to remember the shape of being unfolded. When it was upright, I could see for the first time how tall it was. Not the tall figure's height, but close. Not yet fully grown, but close. The scale color was more vivid in the higher corridor light. The deep blue-gray, and the iridescent edge quality, and the copper-warm crest ridge color. The gold eyes went immediately to the tall figure in the center of the formation. Something passed between them. Not words, not sound. The kind of exchange that happens at a frequency below the range of what I could hear. Then the younger one looked at me. The tall figure at the center also turned to look at me. I did not look away, because I had not spent 31 years of night shifts learning to occupy space by looking away from things. I met the dark water eyes. I kept my hands on the cart handles. The tall figure spoke, not in the tonal language, in something close enough to the common diplomatic tongue that I could follow it, with the quality of someone who has spoken the language for a very long time, and has become precise in it beyond the level of native speakers. It said, "How long?" I said. 3 months and 11 days, it said. "Alone," I said. The compliance officer visited twice. Let him pass the corridor junction. A pause. The dark water eyes moved to the notebook in my apron pocket, visible because I keep it in the front left pocket where I can reach it quickly. It said, "You documented it," I said. "I document everything I find worth documenting. Professional habit." The formation behind the tall figure had gone entirely still. The younger one, the matriarch designate of the Vel-Orth bonding house, as I now understood, was watching this exchange. Its gold eyes moved between the tall figure and me. In the way eyes move when they are following something they consider important, the tall figure said, "You are cleaning staff," I said. "Night shift maid, yes," it said. "And you fed the heir of the Vel-Orth bonding house on field ration from a staff canteen for 3 months, I said. The canteen sold them cheap. They were sufficient for the purpose. The figure was quiet for a moment. Then it said something in the tonal language. A short sequence, 3 intervals, that was addressed not to me, but to the formation around us, and which the formation received in silence. I did not know what it said. I know what was said to me after. The tall figure turned back, and its voice had a different quality now. Not different in tone, because it remained even and precise. Different in the way that a thing changes quality, when it ceases to be assessment and becomes declaration. It said, "Shh." In the Velorith bonding house tradition, a name is given only to those who have tended the house's fire without being asked. There is a word for this. It is not a title. It cannot be held or traded or conferred again. Once again, it belongs to the person. A pause. The word is Keth Osta. I looked at it. I said, "What does it mean?" It said, "The nearest approximation in your language would be the one who tends the door that has no handle from the outside. The one who keeps a thing warm that does not know it is being kept warm and expects nothing for the keeping." I held that for a moment. Then I said, "That's a long word for one name. Corners of the eyes, the outer edges of the gold eyes, between the scale plates, moved in a way that I recognized by that point as the expression this species used when something struck them as both accurate and unexpectedly funny. The younger one made a sound that I was almost certain was a laugh. I thought about what had just happened, in the way I do when something important happens, and my first response is to think about it carefully, rather than react to it. I thought about 31 years of being invisible. I thought about the facility's deputy, who had finally looked at me after I cited Section 11 of the compound charter, and the way that recognition had felt both welcome and insufficient. Welcome because it was genuine, insufficient because it arrived only because I had become useful to him. I thought about the junior attaché who had said I talked to walls, was close enough to true, that the distinction between walls and doors seemed unlikely to reassure him. I thought about the way the present credential of a name like Keth Osta sat in the space of this corridor, next to the ordinary present credential of a night shift maid who still had a wing to finish. Both of those things were true simultaneously. I found that I did not need them to resolve into each other. They could both exist. I was the maid who mopped the ambassador wing, and I was Keth Osta, and neither of those facts diminished the other, and that, after 31 years of doing work that other people looked through without seeing, was a thing worth holding. I said, "I need to go finish the ambassador wing." I left it early to come down here. I looked at the formation, and then at the younger one, and then at the tall figure at the center. You should know there's a compliance officer named Owen Carell with a remediation order that has a counter-signature from the compound director. If your party has standing in the compound's diplomatic framework, you may want to have someone's address that before morning. Or he will be here with a fumigation team, and they will be surprised to find the alcove empty. The tall figure looked at me for a long moment. Then it said, "We will address it." I said, "Good." I turned my cart around and started back down the corridor. Behind me, the formation remained still, and the young one, the matriarch designate, made the single soft note sound I had learned over 3 months, and I did not turn around, but I said, over my shoulder because it was the truth, "I'll come back tomorrow." And I went to mop the ambassador wing. I finished 40 minutes before the day shift. I left the floor station board clean. I brought my cart to the charging alcove and plugged in the polisher and washed my hand at the sub-level wash station and got my coat from the staff locker. When I came through the compound lobby on my way to the staff exit, I noticed that the arrival notification board had been updated. It showed a 7-pulse diplomatic arrival, logged as Velorith Bonding House Continuance Command, with a suite of compound accreditations that I would have needed to read for some time to fully understand, but which I could see, even in passing, included a designation I had not seen before on any arrival board in 11 years, Heritage Custodian Recognition. I did not know exactly what that meant. I made a note of it in my notebook. I went home, I slept, I came back that night. The compliance officer did not come back after that. The remediation order does not appear to have been formally canceled because I checked the administrative record 3 weeks later and found it suspended under a notation I had never seen before, a diplomatic compound notation that cited a heritage designation override. I noted this in my notebook. The Velorith Bonding House Continuance Command remained in residence at the Eastern Frontier Post for 11 days. I do not know what they did during those 11 days. Because my work is the floors and the walls and the sublevel corridors, not the diplomatic suites. I know that the third directorate attachés, who had been having sharp corridor conversations with the Velorith liaison staff, went suddenly and entirely quiet, which was a change I noticed immediately, because corridors have a particular quality of silence when the people in them have stopped arguing and started listening. I noted this. On the third night of the delegation's residence, I was mopping the public corridor outside the diplomatic suite wing when I heard steps behind me. I turned. The young one, the matriarch designate, was in the corridor. Upright now, fully upright, moving at an unhurried pace, with the copper-warm crest ridges, and the blue-gray scale color and the gold eyes that I had come to know, through a 12-centimeter gap in a utility door, not crouched, not folded, not hiding. It stopped beside me. It looked at the floor I had just mopped. It made the knock reply sound. Too short, one long, too short, which I had not heard in the 3 weeks since the door opened all the way. I said, "I know, I see you." It looked at me. Then it walked on down the corridor, into the part of the compound I did not clean, and I turned back to the mop, and the floor was very clean, and the corridor was very quiet, and somewhere in the upper levels of the compound, the diplomatic machinery of the Velorith Bonding House was doing whatever it needed to do. I had a wing and a half left to finish before the day shift came on. On the 11th night, the delegation left. I know this because the arrival notification board showed a 7th pulse departure at 04:15, which I saw on my way out. The notation beside the departure entry read, Velorith Bonding House Continuance Command, full suite. Below that, in the smaller administrative field where departures are categorized, was a designation I had to read twice. Heritage Site Secure, mission complete. I did not know exactly what that meant in full. I understood enough of it to know that the thing I had been keeping company through a door for 3 months and 11 days had been found and was safe, and was going home. I stood in the lobby for a moment and looked at the board. Then I went to the sublevel B stairwell and walked down to Junction 4B and stood in the corridor that was once again empty and half-lit and quiet with vac hum and the distant tremor of overnight freight passage in the levels above. The alcove door was closed. The biometric latch panel was dark. At the base of the door, folded carefully flat so it would not blow away in the ventilation current, was a piece of material, not paper, some finer, with the quality of material that is made to last. And on it, in a precise hand, was written a sequence in a script I did not know, and below it in the common diplomatic tongue, 4 words, for the keeping. Keth Osta. I picked it up. I looked at it for a moment. Then I folded carefully, put it front left pocket of my apron, next to the notebook. I went to do the floors. The ambassador wing took 40 minutes. I finished with 11 minutes to spare before the day shift. I brought the cart to the charging alcove and plugged in the polisher and washed my hands and got my coat. And I stopped in the lobby on my way out and looked at the arrival notification board, which showed no current arrivals and no pending departures, which is what it shows on most mornings, which is the ordinary condition of an ordinary frontier diplomatic compound on an ordinary night. I thought, standing in the lobby, about the document in my pocket, about the word Keth Osta, about the precision of the translation the tall figure had given me, and the way precision in a translation indicates someone who has thought carefully about language and about meaning and about the difference between what a word says and what a word means. The one who tends the door that has no handle from the outside, the one who keeps a thing warm that does not know it is being kept warm, and expects nothing for the keeping. That is a statement about the act, not about the person performing it. It says nothing about the person being exceptional or skilled or remarkable. It says only, they tended, they kept, they did not stop, and it considers this sufficient to name. I thought about whether I would tell anyone. The facility's deputy, perhaps. Not the substance, not the Velorith air in the sublevel utility alcove, that was no longer mine to tell, but the name itself, the designation on the document, the 4 words. For the keeping. I thought about what his face would do. I thought about whether his face doing that thing would give me anything I needed. I decided it would not. Some things are not for sharing. Not because they are secret, but because they are complete. A name that means the one who stays does not require the confirmation of someone who watched me mop floors for 11 years. It is true without the confirmation. It was always true without it. The confirmation was never the point. Put on my coat. I went home. The compliance officer's remediation order is still suspended. The infrastructure notes in my notebook now run to 112 pages. The foundation joint under Junction 4B has not been addressed. I have submitted 3 follow-up reports. There is a section in the notebook. I began it the week after the delegation left. That is not infrastructure. I did not plan to begin it. I was writing the follow-up report on the foundation joint and I found I had, without quite deciding to, turned to a fresh page and written what I know about the Vel Oreth bonding house. Below that I wrote what I had learned from the public archive and from the marking chart and from the 3 months of a door opened by increments and tonal sequences I had recorded as best I could, and the things the tall figure with the dark water eyes had said in a corridor at 2:40 in the morning to a night shift maid who cited Section 11 of the compound charter and refused to move her cart. I filled 6 pages. Do not know who will ever read those pages. Possibly only me. That is all right. The notebook is not for an audience. It is for the record, and the record is its own reason. I am Asta Farron. I am 63 years old. I have worked the night shift at the Eastern Frontier Post for 11 years, and at other buildings before that, for 31 years total. I talk to doors when the doors are worth talking to. I document things other people do not think are worth documenting. I tend to the floors nobody looks at, and the corridors nobody goes down, and the infrastructure problems nobody wants to write the repair order for. I am, as of 3 weeks ago, also Keth Osta. I go back to work tomorrow.